Hey everybody, welcome back to Movement Monday. Today's topic of discussion is the hip hinge. So basically, this is just a movement pattern of the hip. It's what we'd consider maybe a primal pattern, something that's very functional that humans are kind of born to do, much like the squat. Speaking of the squat, if you can differentiate from a movement standpoint between the squat and the hinge, you'll be light years ahead of other people who are trying to work out. The reason that is if you know how to do a hip hinge versus a squat, you're going to know how to properly load certain muscle groups that are going to be helpful for the exercise that you're doing depending on what it's trying to target. So understand that the hip hinge is a movement pattern that loads up the muscles, all the muscles that you can't see, primarily the butt and the hamstrings, and of course the spinal erectors and other things in the back as well. As opposed to the squat, which of course does activate those muscles, but primarily the squat will activate more muscles on the front side, so like the quads and things like that. So for you to be able to differentiate that is very important. So I want you to understand first how the hip hinge works, and I think one of the most effective ways that we can demonstrate this is for you to simply understand that this is a movement of horizontal movement as opposed to vertical movement like in the squat. So just check this out. This is the hip hinge that is unloaded just using my body weight, and most of you, especially if you're beginners, you're getting hip hinges in your programming all the time. So here's the hip hinge. Okay, so when I mentioned that that movement is back and forward or horizontal, what I'm talking about is the movement of my hips. So if you were to just trace a line, an imaginary line as my hips move, I want you to see that that's a horizontal line. So check it out again. Draw this imaginary line. Back and forward. As opposed to a squat, which takes us, draw your line again, down and up, okay? So the more the knee bends, like in a squat, the more it's gonna be quad dominant, of course, as you stand up against load. Why is the hip hinge important? Again, because it loads the butt and hamstring. A lot of people are weak in that area because a lot of times you've spent your time in the gym not focusing on muscles that you can't see, but you're focusing on the things that you can see. So it's important that you understand how to load those things. How does it apply to progression over time? Well, of course, we want to load up that exercise over time so we can get stronger. So you'll see that we'll move from more kind of static strength, static term I'm using loosely there relative to other things, but we move from static things to more dynamic things over time depending on who you are. Just make sure that you can identify that hip hinge pattern in the movements that I'm about to demonstrate. So one way that we easily add load to the hip hinge is by just taking a kettlebell and pressing it to our belly. So watch this. Now that I have load, I'm going to do the same thing. Butt back, squeeze my butt and stand up. The most important thing that you'll see with all these movements is that my back stays really, really flat. So I have to focus on arching at my upper back a little bit, okay? And you should feel this in your butt and hamstrings. Weight is in the heels, feet are just underneath the hips. So the next progression I can do beyond that loaded hip hinge is a deadlift. The pattern is the same. I send my hips back, grab the bar, and stand. Hip hinge. I'm sure you noticed again that looks exactly the same as the body weight hip hinge. And again, let's just go over a little bit of points of performance. Feet underneath the shoulders, chest is up tall. My weight is in my heels. I arch my upper back, not through here, but through up here. Just get nice and tall. Send my hips back. My knees will bend just a little bit. My chin stays tucked in, so not here, but here. And then I just stand up, squeeze my butt tight. Once I get proficient at that, I might move to some more dynamic exercises. This permits me to learn more dynamic exercises like the kettlebell swing. Again, the primary focus here is just to understand that the hip hinge is in a lot of different movements. So here's something like the kettlebell swing. See if you can identify that hip hinge pattern again. What you might have thought there is, that looks a lot like a jump, like I'm loading up for a jump. So if I'm trying to jump forward, I'm going to hinge at my hips and explode forward. It's the same thing. It's all loading up the hip. Same thing with the box jump. I hinge, and I jump. So that, of course, moves from a more powerful, or I guess I shouldn't say powerful, but kind of a more standard lift that's a little more slow and controlled, but focuses primarily on strength, to more dynamic things like the kettlebell swing, to an even more dynamic thing like the box jump where you're actually leaving the ground. So again, just to kind of wrap that up, the hip hinge, very important to understand that that is a back and forth movement as opposed to a down and up. There's a little bit of down and up, but it's relative to what movement you're doing. But primarily, you're loading those muscles, butt and hamstrings, by moving back. You're kind of applying a stretch to those muscles back there. And understanding that the function of those muscles is also to open the hip or stand up. Very important that people utilize those muscle groups and get some strength there in the butt and the hamstrings. Super, super important. And we start with easy progressions like the body weight hip hinge, maybe start to load that up with the kettlebell pressed against our belly, and then of course everybody over time is going to learn how to pick objects up off the ground. So that's the primary focus for 99% of the population, but of course that hip hinge can be applied over time to more dynamic movements like the kettlebell swing and box jump. So I hope you understand and enjoy the hip hinge.